The next presentation we have is Professor Rachael Taylor from Otago University, the project lead for Moemoeā, and Justine Camp, the research fellow at Otago as well, and the Māori lead researcher for Moemoeā. Rachael is a nutritionist by training who has spent many years working with whānau and communities around encouraging healthy eating, activity and sleep. She's the director of Edgar Diabetes Obesity Research Centre and professor in medicine at the University of Otago, and the theme leader of the Healthy Weight Theme E Tipu Erea National Science Challenge, which aims to give all tamariki a better start in life. And we also have Justine Camp, who's a PhD research fellow at the University of Otago, working on Moemoeā, and her previous fellowships included Big Data, exploring the use of data and its impact on Māori, and Brain Research New Zealand, exploring whānau perspectives on neurostimulation and neurosurgery. Those are two difficult words to wrap your tongue around on a Friday after a big week. Justine holds a number of governance roles, including chair of the iwi Governance Committee on the Southern DHB, I'm assuming, and Justine is part of the mana whenua design team working on the co-design of the new Dunedin Hospital. And she's a mother of one and a taua of one. Now they're going to be talking about the Moemoeā study and some of the ways it harnessed the power of traditional knowledge to support that nurturing and connection for Māori and Pasifika whānau. So please put your hands together for our next speakers.
Tēnā tahi tātou, koutou tēnei ki te mihi atu ki a koutou. I te tuatahi e te paua, nau tēnei hui whakatūwhera, he mihi mahana ki a koe mo tēnā. Ki a koutou te mana whenua tēnei rohe, te ati awa, Ngāti Toa. He mihi mahana tēnei, nau koutou ahika e whakamahana tēnei whenua mō tātou. Nō reira, ka nui te mihi ki a koutou, kua tai mai, te whakaroko ki a tātou, he mihi hoki ki a koutou. Me huri au ki tōku nei, kai korero tuatahi mō te rā. So kia ora koutou, I just did the quick mihi and Rachel's going to take over. I'm going to have a noho and then I'll get up and waffle a little bit later. Kia ora.
Well, kia ora koutou te katoa. Thanks very much to Amanda and the team for inviting us to talk about Moemoeā, our project, which we're really excited about. I'm a mother of 3 teenage boys and I'm really interested in the sleep space. Not enough to have number 4, I might add, but maybe one day with Moemoeā. So yeah, talking about a project that's really led by a number of people, and I know Rose and the Moana team are going to talk to you more this afternoon about some of their work in the sleep space. So it's no news to anyone here, but 1 in 10 children in New Zealand are obese, and there are marked inequities in that obesity, particularly with respect to ethnicity and deprivation. And once you add in the levels of overweight as well, those differences become even more stark. However, there is actually some good news. I'm not sure if many are aware, but part of the work we've been doing as part of the National Science Challenge is showing that the prevalence of overweight and obesity is coming down in our youngest tamariki. So our before school check data are showing quite really exciting decreases in the prevalence of obesity, and most exciting is the fact that it's occurring across all ethnic groups, all levels of deprivation, all parts of the country. So somehow we're doing something in that early childhood space very well. Traditionally, I come from an obesity background and interested in that area, and of course mostly when we think about obesity we think of tackling sort of diet and physical activity, what we eat and how much exercise we do. Unfortunately, the research to date really doesn't have much to show for in terms of success, in terms of what's happening in that space. And this is from the most recent review that's been done in this space, talking about interventions, obesity prevention interventions in 0 to 5-year-olds. And it's really that last column that I want you to look at. So diet-only interventions likely to result in little to no difference. Physical activity interventions likely do not reduce BMI. Now, we know that we need multi-pronged approaches when we're talking about obesity prevention, but this last comment on the bottom right there doesn't really fill you with great confidence and success, does it? So diet and physical activity interventions in this space might potentially slightly reduce BMI. It's not exactly overwhelming evidence. And part of the issue really, I think, is because we have been relatively focused in this obesity space in terms of just looking at what people eat and how much they move. In more recent years, we have started to look more at sedentary behaviour as a separate behaviour from physical activity. So you can be both active and sedentary. It is possible to be both. But until relatively recently, we haven't paid much attention to sleep. Now, I come from a nutrition background, as originally said, but actually I think sleep's got a huge role to play in this space. And one of the most exciting things about it, from someone who does a lot of intervention work, is it's also a behaviour that parents want to hear about. They want help with, they're receptive to it. They're generally much less receptive to nutrition-related information. What people may be not as aware of is we also may see some inequities in the number of children meeting sleep guidelines. So overall, about 60 to 80% of New Zealand children, according to the latest health survey, do meet sleep guidelines, but there are some differences there. So much lower percentage in our Pacific children, for instance, than we see in European children. And the beauty, I think, of this, and this is no surprise to this audience, you're obviously all interested in sleep, is that sleep, trying to improve sleep, is such a great vehicle for improving health and well-being in a whole variety of areas. Anyone who's been a parent, grandparent knows a sleeping baby makes life a lot easier in a whole variety of other areas. But we know throughout children that as well as being quite a strong predictor of obesity, it helps children be more active. It's really important for their mental health across all ages. It helps them cope better at school, and it does decrease the chances of engaging in risky behaviour. So there are so many benefits to sleep health promotion. It's amazing really that the obesity field have been pretty tardy in picking it up. And I still go to a lot of obesity workshops where they're really just not interested in sleep. They don't think it's got much to do with anything really, despite some of us banging on about it for quite some time. So we've actually known for about 30 years that having good sleep is actually important for your body weight in children. So these are data from that very first study about 30 years ago that was done in France. That was a case control study. They had a large sample of overweight children, and there was a lot of factors that seemed to be related to child obesity, but the single remaining factor, once they had controlled for parents' obesity, was how well the child slept. And so children who did not receive 11 hours of sleep at night in this particular age group had a much greater increased risk of obesity. Since then, the data have actually been overwhelmingly consistent. No single dietary behaviour or physical activity behaviour has anywhere near the consistency in the evidence supporting the role for it in an obesity sense. Sleep really does have an incredibly consistent, strong relationship with obesity. So these are just from meta-analyses which try and give you an overall idea. And what they're essentially saying is that young people with a short sleep have about twice the risk of obesity as children who sleep well. We do seem to see it in all age groups. There's a bit of variation in terms of how strong that relationship is. Virtually every study independently, and certainly when you lump them all together, and the meta-analyses really show quite clearly that it increases the risk of obesity. It's not just, though, about how much you sleep. It's also about how well you sleep, so your sleep quality. The data on sleep quality and obesity aren't as strong, and part of that's a bit of a measurement. How long you sleep for is one sort of single thing, relatively easy to measure. How well you sleep is assessed in a million different ways, from the percentage of time you spend asleep, how many minutes in the night you wake up for after you've gone to sleep the first time, how good you feel in the morning, so your sort of sleep perception, a whole variety of ways. But the data still show that your quality of sleep is also really important for your body weight. And this is all of us as adults as well. The data aren't quite as strong in adults as it is in children, but really important in the childhood space. Main problem is, though, we don't know why, and that rather complicated slide has a lot of question marks on it because we don't really know why sleeping well actually leads to a reduced risk of obesity. There has been a lot of suggestion. It makes sense, of course. If you're tired, you probably don't want to be as physically active, and that applies to children as well. It may make you indulge in screen time a bit more. Screen time, of course, though, prior to bed is also not very good for our sleep, so there's all sorts of relationships there. There was a lot of interest initially in sort of your appetite hormones, so that if you're sleep deprived, it influenced your appetite hormones, and that's how it adversely affected your ability to maintain your own body weight. Doesn't seem to be the case. We're not finding a lot of evidence there. It could be as simple as you just got more time to go to the fridge. And so it's a behavioural thing. If you're tired, you may crave different foods more. You may have more emotional eating. There seems to be more evidence for sort of this side of the energy balance equation, that it changes what we eat than how we move. But there's still quite a lot of work to be done in that space. This is just to give you an example of the sort of projects that have been trying to answer this question, because if we can see that it's more on the diet side, for instance, that's where we need to pursue our energies in terms of changing those behaviours as well. So this is from a study in 3 to 4 year olds. All they did was restricted their sleep for one night for about 3 hours. So reduced it by about 3 hours. They didn't let them have a nap, and then they made them go to bed late, and then they got them up the next day at a certain amount of time. And then they measured how much energy they ate the following day on the restriction day. So this is the day after their poor sleep, and then after one night of full recovery. So they went to go to bed early, they fully recovered that one sleep. What they were able to show was that on that first day after a bad sleep, they ate 21% more energy. So they had a huge increase in the amount of energy they ate in their diet. And even after a recovery sleep, they're still eating about 14% more energy. Now, if that continues, obviously over time, you can very clearly see how that would lead to excess weight. So that really was what led to our POI study, which was almost a precursor, if you like, of Moemoeā. And so POI, we're actually seeing these children again now. They're 11 years of age, so this was sort of developed about 12 to 13 years ago when we got started. We managed to convince more than 800 Dunedin whānau to come into this 2-year intervention, and so we recruited the women in the latter stages of their pregnancy. We only have Queen Mary Hospital in Dunedin, with the exception of home births, which is less than 3% of all births. So most of the women come into Queen Mary. Everyone, of course, got well child care because that's part of our normal system. But we did have 3 intervention groups. We had a fairly traditional food, activity and breastfeeding intervention, but what I'm going to talk about more was our sleep intervention. So at the time, this was fairly novel. There really hadn't been any sleep interventions for the prevention of childhood obesity. And the thing about the sleep intervention was that it was really, really brief. So what we did is we got the mums and their partners, if they had one, to come into an antenatal session and talk to them, and then we went into the homes when the infants were around 3 weeks of age and spent about half an hour to 3/4 of an hour with each whānau. That was mostly it. When the infants were 6 months of age, we asked the parents if they felt their child had a sleep problem, and then if they did, would they like some additional help. But only about half said they felt they had an issue, but only about a quarter took up that extra help, and only about 10% took up sort of a relatively full-on intervention. Most of it was very, very brief. In the antenatal session, very similar to a lot of what Whainuri were just saying in the earlier session, was really about telling them what was coming in the intervention, and about setting realistic expectations. They are going to be tired. There's not too many ways around that, but there is opportunity to provide support from the Māori whānau, as we've just talked about, to actually make that easier for the mum. And so things like really tried to reiterate to them that if they're, Auntie Mabel used to go on about her babies sleeping through the night at 2 weeks of age, that Auntie Mabel's babies were abnormal, more than normal, if you like. That it's normal for babies to wake up in the night. It's a normal sort of part. And it's a normal part for quite a long time. Even by 4 months of age, only about half babies sleep what might be considered through the night. And that's still only about 8 hours, not the 7 p.m. to the 7 a.m, which you might be thinking of as sleeping through the night. In the 3-week session, we went into the home and there was a variety of resources. We had sleep-trained nurses that chatted to the mums and the wider whānau, how sleep was going, were they having any issues, what would they like help with, all those sorts of things. And there were a variety of points. Oh, sorry. Can you send that back, sorry, one? Thanks. So there was quite a lot around safe sleep. This was the one that really interested me at the time, and this was in the hospital setting. That was a focus of our lactation consultants. Remember, this is 12 or 13 years ago, but this was about only really perhaps mum and maybe one other person handling the baby in that first few days in hospital. And then after that, that was fine. And so take the time not to have everyone visit you and so on. I found that a intriguing one, shall we say. But learn how to act on tired signs, about putting your pēpē to bed while awake so that they learnt to sleep to go by themselves, not to cry all night for hours on end or anything like that, but sort of what worked for each family. And essentially we were amazed by the results when it came to obesity prevention. So this was a very brief intervention. Most of these people we hadn't seen in an intervention sense since the babies were 3 weeks of age. When we measured the babies at 2 years of age, those children who had received the sleep intervention had only about half the risk of obesity as those children who hadn't received the sleep intervention. A halving in obesity risk in an obesity prevention program in children is almost unheard of. What is definitely unheard of is that that intervention effect lasted. So by the time these children were 5 years of age, the beneficial effect had, if anything, increased. Now, most of the time when we remove resources in an intervention sense, your intervention effect disappears, of course. Somehow, we still haven't really got to the bottom of how, this intervention had a really long-lasting effect on childhood obesity. And as I mentioned, we've measured them again at currently measuring them at 11, and it'll be interesting to see if those benefits have been maintained. But it wasn't Dunedin, it was essentially a white middle-class population, not a huge variety in terms of ethnic groups. We did have a reasonable spread in terms of deprivation, with all the difficulties that measuring household deprivation involves and so on, but it was a relatively homogenous group. And we know from work that we have done since, and that will be talked about a bit this afternoon, and that you guys have done yourself in your HPA work, that many of these sleep messages, particularly the ones that were around 12 or 13 years ago, really don't fit the lived realities of many of our whānau. And so asking them, for instance, to have a quiet, dark sleep space, or the baby in their own bedroom, doesn't necessarily fit on the marae, in multi-generational households, perhaps for solo parents with large numbers of children. You know, a lot of those guidelines are just not practical. Not using screens before bed. And a lot of the work we did with whānau, that was really seen as a fantastic, relaxing way for all the whānau to get together to relax prior to bed. So it wasn't a recommendation that they were remotely interested in. So they're not necessarily the messages they want or believe. So how can we do this better? And that really puts over to Justine, to Moemoeā.
Tēnā nō tātou. So this is our logo. So I've actually been working with our weavers who are doing the WAakura contract in Ōtepoti as part of the hospital rebuild and the model of care that the Māori model of care I'm developing for the new hospital. We've got a weaving garden so that the weavers can practice what they do as part of a new healthcare model for the new hospital. So quite exciting. And one of those weavers we sat down with, and this is how she likes to draw and actually do her moko. So the 3 strands on it are essentially the 3 components of the 3 themes of our sleep program. One is rongo time, uru time, and whānau, we're calling it. So I'll talk a bit about that. I feel really short. Forward, this feels backwards, by the way. Oh. So this is quite a old iteration of our project, and I think we've moved a little bit, but one of the things when you've got 3 distinct groups looking at 3 distinct parts of a project and then trying to explain it to others. We were trying really, really hard to kind of sit down together and work out what it is that we're doing. So our other limb is at the back table and they'll be presenting after us, our Pacific limb. But this is for the most intervention part of it, which I still don't fully understand. That's not really my role in the project. And Rachel will probably explain it in more detail later, so I'm just going to move on to the bits I actually understand. So together, I think, especially with our Pacific team, we kind of knew that the sort of the underpinning, the overarching, the maru, the whatever you want to call it, the concept that we really wanted to look at was the notion of connectedness. So obviously, when we look at hono, honoka, tātai, hono, all of those sorts of things, it's a bit more broad than just, you know, mama connected to pēpē. It's connected to your whakapapa, to your place, and to all of those things. And as a concept, I think it's probably the best way that we could have connected the aspects of the project that we were looking for. In the end, why kai and karakia, the way I've put that there is, so I'm more of a whanau order researcher, definitely not a sleep person. This is new to me, so not standing here as an expert at all. And the tools that whanau typically use to mediate their hauora and their well-being, when you look at tikanga, are essentially these tools. So I figured if that's what we do later on in life, to look after ourselves, it seemed like a really good idea to support whānau, to instill that in their pēpē from the time they're born. So why? We've made that really, really broad for all the activity people in here. We've actually looked at the whole concept of blue space. So it's from anything from going for a walk at the beach, going for a koko, or having a 20-minute shower when you want to break from your mokopuna, if you can get someone else to keep them entertained while you're doing that. The kai was obviously at the age that we're looking at, it will be feeding, breastfeeding, bottle feeding, whatever it is the whānau needs to do. And karakia we've extended to all forms of pūrākau, essentially. So we've been writing ore jingles, we're calling them. So when I explain the different components, hopefully you'll understand how they work. And we have been writing karakia. Our kaitito in Tauranga Moana had a first round, took them back out to the community, and the kaumātua said, "You've gone too deep." Simplify it a little bit, you know, you don't have to do the entire whakapapa of te ao in your ore and your karakia. So yeah, we're now trying to be a little bit more focused with what we're trying to write. And I haven't put the example up, but yeah, I'll explain it in a little bit. So yeah, there are 3 main components that we know mediate our well-being and that we wanted to capture in this. I think I just went along head there. Yeah, so when we look at those tools, obviously when you look at all our ceremonies and all of the things we do publicly, so this morning we had a little bit of a whakanoa, we had our kai first, we had our karakia, and well, we're drinking water, and we're next to the water, so all is well for us today. And when I guess compared all the ceremonies, I kind of realised that while they may seem simple, waikai and karakia, they're definitely well and truly grounded in tikanga. So the Better Start has 3 major themes. One was mental health, early learning and literacy, and healthy weight. And when you sort of start looking across those areas in terms of research, I think the one thing that connects them all that we were able to relate to sleep was the idea of wairua and that the notion of kia tau, and the idea that when you're going to sleep, it's all about settling that wairua and making sure it's having a good journey while you're asleep and comes back and keeps you well. So that works really well in education as well. So obviously if you've got a teacher that's mean to the children, then they're impacting on their wairua in a really negative way. And the same sort of thing, I think if you go for extreme sport, you know, that's that whole idea of breaking yourself a little bit, but also using it to heal yourself a wee bit too. So on that note, great thing about lockdown last year was some people are here really, really crazy to get hold, just impossible to get hold of. Everybody wants a piece of you, and so when you have everybody in lockdown, you can actually pin people down because you know they're going to be at home. So yeah, upside of COVID, I guess. And so I'd been In my brain core mahi, I'd done quite a bit of work with Ihi and Ricky Solomon. In my PhD, the maramataka was one of my measures, including around sleep. And I don't know if you've followed Ihi's Facebook, his mobile wānanga thing, where he's gone round and talking, you know, the interaction with the 200 plus atua that both them and Iriata and everybody have been looking at. And so I kind of, it was like a do-over, which is like what a mokopuna is. You bring up your child, you keep them alive, you survive the teenage years, and then they give you a mokopuna and you get a do-over and you get to do it better. And so I kind of felt like the sleep progress a little bit with that. I missed, in my PhD research, I'd put atua in, so I'd worked with Hotu Rōku and Jacko Thatcher and developed a whānau health compass. And we'd put the atua stuff in and we didn't quite get to do it. So this is my mokopuna do-over. I get to relate the sleep stuff to the atua. That's the frame that we're doing. So that's why I managed to have a zui with Ihi and start with tell me about atua and sleep. Sat down with Ricky. So there was a lot of data that came out when you look at the cycles that were happen within the maramataka, and so one of the indicators in my whānau compass was sleep. Whānau would every single day for months say, was your sleep oranga enhancing or oranga diminishing? And because they were recording the maramataka at the same time, you were able to see the cycles. And so wanted to sort of see if we could bring that in as well. And great news is we think we've got it in there. So we had this different version. So I know that Moeahuru's also, I've missed her in there, but essentially the atua that was sort of associated with sleep, light, dark, night and day. So if you catch a late night flight and you see the sun setting and you've got the black sky above and the light below and the bit of red, that's uru, I guess. He's in that intermediate space. And transitions is probably something I should have mentioned a little earlier, but obviously sleep is a transition. And so I guess uru was the transition between night and day and awake and asleep. To that end. Oh, there was uru time. How do I go back? So, uru time is actually one of the components. Yeah, so we've written ori to the uru atua. So when you're singing to the pēpē, it takes you through sort of a settling transition, asking those atua to do, basically get your wairua ready for sleep. We've got karakia that do the same thing. As I said, they've been a bit too deep. So the settling transition that happens with the pēpē, we've called uru time, which is quite cool. And it has a bunch of resources. Right, now I can. Both, and I think there'll be a lot more data in our limbs kōrero after this one, but we actually wanted to sit around and look and talk with whānau about what actually sleep looks like for them. We did sit around, we had kai, wai and some karakia and some laughs. And essentially all the whānau that we talked to at some point in our lives, we co-sleep. So we wanted to be able to get the information without making people feel bad for what they actually do. And we do obviously have some Pākehā sleep researchers, and so we did actually then sit down with them saying, okay, we don't want people to feel guilty. Not everybody has a house with one bedroom for each child, and quite frankly, some of us just like the idea of being close together actually. So, you know, we realise we will have to put the safe sleep message in there. Whānau reported sleeping marae styles, especially in times of stress. So like times like COVID, it was amazing how many people, and for those who don't know what marae styles is, that's when the whole whānau grabs a mattress and they sleep in the same space. That's certainly a normal practice in my household, and it turned out it was in the other whānau that we spoke with. Some of them did it differently. Like we actually had one whānau where they moved the kids' mattresses into the parents' bedroom because they didn't want to spend the day sitting on the mattresses doing things during lockdown. Very active whānau. They were like professional sporties. But that's quite common and normal. Most whānau that I spoke to don't leave or put the kid to bed awake and walk away. So we're often there touching and snuggling and doing all of those things essentially until our babies are asleep. And I think we sort of turned out all right for doing that. So, you know, we're not going to say that's a bad thing. Tū whānau, not many. So most of us essentially, when you say where do you get your information about raising children and support and all that, it is typically within whānau. So those of us that I think are actually lucky enough to live intergenerationally. So there's 4 generations in my household at the moment. Not sure if it's great for my mother, but the rest of us it's fantastic. And so yeah, I learnt my parenting practice from my mother and her from hers and so on and so forth. So that is typically how it works. But there were a couple of whānau that did, obviously, from their midwives and then plunket or whānau, what are the tamariki order nurses? That's the one. So yeah, we kind of needed to know that so that we obviously do have plunket as one of our partners, but needing to know, you know, where they get the information from, because we shouldn't be undoing thousands of years of traditional knowledge and then tell them that that's what it is, right? Yeah, and our cohort, and it wasn't a massive cohort by any means, but yeah, we often had at least 2 generations involved in settling pēpē, so we didn't make the assumption that it was the mother. Obviously, typically at potentially around 3 months, if it's a nursing mother, it is predominantly their job, but it is a whānau affair, so the mother might do the nursing. We had one grandfather who can do like 20 verse karakia, and so he was the one that did that, and by the end of it, you know, they were well asleep. And actually ask anyone who's watched their parent or a grandparent put a kid to bed, and they start having a kōrero literally from the time you turn up, and then they get them to sleep. It might take 4 hours, but you know, I think there's something there we need to replicate. All whānau were child-led, so we had, excuse me, don't have COVID, promise. We have one whānau that the child won't sleep, so the rest of the household sleeps at night time, and this wee fella just stays up and does his thing, and then, you know, maybe about once a month he has to have a few days off kura. But she didn't see it as a problem. So at the end of the day, I still don't think it's our role to go in there and say, actually, what you're doing is wrong. It works for their whānau. He generally does okay, apart from his few days off school. Still a bright young thing. So I think that was really, really important. Like, if people don't see it as an issue, then we're wasting our time as well. So we wanted to kind of capture what was happening so that we're also not going in there once we create something and say, actually, what you do is wrong. Because that was the whole point. Absolutely all of the whānau that we worked with had some form of those ideas of the whakanoa type activity, which is obviously for transition, because whakanoa is transition. But what ours included a lot more of was the snuggles, cuddles, rocking. I feel like waikai, karakia and snuggles is a little bit missing, but I'm trying to get there. So our second po that we were calling them is rongo time. So again, going back to the notion of atua. So I think you talked about it earlier around, you know, what can you do for the mamas or the people that are essentially doing the settling. So I know that as a taua, that because I was successfully got his mother to sleep, I was calm whenever I was settling him. So I was able to, you know, spend 2 hours fighting him until he got to sleep, singing to him and walking him around the house and doing lunges and things. And my heartbeat would have been calm, whereas parents get racked up and, oh my God, go to sleep. So the chorus in one of our ori, it's like, oh we e moe, oh we e moe. Just give the parents a little bit of ha ha. So yeah, what can we do for that mama? So the idea of kia tau, you know, like, it's not feeling calm and it's not feeling hectic. You can be tau in a situation where it's, you know, absolutely chaotic. So sometimes you get the whole whānau over. So for us, when I was a child, around March, April, depending on when mutton birding season started, all our whānau would be travelling from wherever, and they would stop with us before they went down to the TT Islands. I'd be kicked out of my bed in the middle of the night, and your household was full. At one point, one of our mutton birders had a pet possum, and he actually took it to the islands, which is, in hindsight, probably not particularly wise. But during those times, we were just as happy as when it was just us. So at the end of the day, we wanted something bigger. And so I thought about rongo, who's certainly not someone I channel particularly well. So it's always a good learning game. So having to go and talk to people that are more peaceful than myself has actually been quite fun. So we've been looking at the different, I guess, personas of rongo. I think they called them honorific titles. And the ones I've sort of decided to focus on, obviously, is rongo himself. So we've been looking at, I guess, de-escalation language, so sitting down with mental health experts and Māori counsellors and people that aren't like me, that rack things up as opposed to calm them down. And looking at reo and language around that. Rongo marairo, so it's the great expanse, it's typically the ocean, but the great thing is when you get to go way back, you can kind of reinterpret things for a current context. So if you can imagine even just a rugby field, taking the whānau for a walk to a rugby field and giving mama a break or something, especially if you've got other kids in the house and it's a little bit cray-cray at the time. So going to a big wide open space, and actually the notion of you're there, you're this one wee speck in the universe, and looking at a great open space and having to take it in, that whole process is about, you know, that kia tau, achieving that with that particular rongo. So we want to, and we think that's where the physical activity comes in. In terms of nutrition, so we want to write some jingles and see if we can start encouraging whānau to make connections with healthy kai, i.e. planting their gardens. So we're writing wee things that it makes it fun, so the kids can sing to their plants, they can sing or do a karakia when they're planting something, and so just sort of fun outdoor activities, or i.e. connections with rongo, with some resources to encourage people to do that, assuming that they're not one of those whānau that's in a hotel. But then I think rongo himself will hopefully help there. So that's our other sort of major component. As you could imagine, mainstream measures aren't going to measure this particularly well. And so we are currently trying to develop some measures to measure this. And I'm just in the middle of interviews at the moment about that. Our third one, I wanted to call Whanau Asset. So again, we're trying to be strength based, and we're sort of trying to say actually what we do and what you do is awesome for you, not you're a problem that needs to be fixed. And so in big data world, they do a lot of stuff around community assets, and they're silly things like having a church or having a marae in your community, or even having a slot machine thing. I'm so tired, I've been here for 3 days. And so, yeah, we wanted to kind of look at, even if you're a young mum who's 16 and you're a sole parent, you probably still got some form of support if you don't have whānau. And so it's partly about taking stock of what you do have, and one of those opportunities for us to see what you may not have. So we had a student at our university, and her plunket nurse had come in and she was using packet food, pouches, and her whānau were away because she'd come down to study, and she didn't have a support network, and she basically got told, don't feed your kid that stuff. So you could imagine she was in tears, trying really hard just to survive and doing the best that she could, quite frankly. And it turns out there's like a nannies network in Dunedin, and so she'd managed to actually go to the Māori support staff in the hospital actually, and they hooked her up with the nannies network, and they did teach her to cook, but also you have to think about, can they afford it, and what judgments you're making to people, and what time they have. If they're time poor, then they don't have time to cook, and if they don't live intergenerationally, they don't have a mum to do all your cooking and do your washing, do everything while you learn to be a parent. So really, really aware that, you know, we need to be tactful and we need to be supportive so that we can uplift our whānau as well. So this one's, more about what have you got and what do you need. So they're the 3 components that we're attempting to come up with and measure. How will we measure success? I don't know. Quite frankly, we're still trying to work out how to measure this. But I mean, what we do know is that so in terms of rongo time, all we could find was this idea of chaos theory, chaos. And so, again, as I said, during certain times, like I could be at a hui and I'm feeling just as happy and content as if I'm at home alone binging on Netflix. So the idea of having to have a quiet space in a dark room and an individual room for a baby certainly doesn't meet our Māori and Pacific ways of living when we're nice big whānau. In today's reality, like how many millions are they spending on hotels? So it's not even their choice whether they want to live that way or not. So, and we're assuming it's a problem because it's noisy. So I'm from a big whānau, and when I was learning to put my daughter to bed, Mum always said, if you're not going to be in the room talking to her, put the radio on. She needs to get used to noise. And that's partly about hui hopping, and then when you've got, you know, a big whānau, you can't sleep in the quiet. So at the end of the day, we want to, the measures that currently exist won't measure that particular scenario, and certainly not in a way that wouldn't make us look bad. And we don't think what we do is bad. So, yeah, we've had months of definitely, we're all on the same page, Māori are not the problem, the way we do things are not the problem. And so we're currently looking and talking with some Māori data experts at this point. So it turns out we've tried to develop some questions that will measure well-being, sleep, rongo time, and with the obesity and stuff, everything's quite easy. At this point, our questions were great, but just not useful for an online survey. So yesterday I had a 2-hour lecture on how to rewrite the questions and the formula that needs to happen so that people actually answer them without you having to talk through the questions, and how to write them actively, because I'm a passive writer, because I'm Māori. So yeah, it's fun, I think. Oh. Now to the bit I don't understand.
Kia ora, thanks Justine. I think she's underplaying the huge amount of work that her and her team are putting into that space. And for me as a Pākehā researcher, it's been a really exciting learning curve, because a lot of this makes sense, but is totally new to me in that context, but makes sense. So as Justine said, this is our old model, but we have these 3 things that we want to test. And so I work in the intervention space, and normally when we want to test something, we do a randomised controlled trial. So, you know, we'd do a standard classical randomised controlled trial. So everyone would either be in the intervention group, where you would get all 3 components. So whatever is developed, you'd get all of that help and support, or nothing. That's the way sort of randomised controlled trials work. Then what happens is, hopefully, of course, because you've developed these wonderful intervention, you'd get to the end and you'd find you'd had great success, whatever that success actually is. The problem is, this is a very black box, because you've put all 3 in here and you've tested the outcome in total. You don't actually know which bits worked and which bits didn't. We have incredibly scarce health resources, as we all know, so if we could work out actually that Orongo was really successful at changing whatever it is that we want to change, but Uru didn't seem to have much effect, then we wouldn't bother perhaps doing Uru in the future, or we'd perhaps change how we did it, and maybe that might be part of it. Or it might be that one of these, that actually this is the key thing, and it's really just support. It doesn't matter what else is happening as long as the support is there. So the method that we're going to use will let us see if each component has an individual effect, an additive effect, so if it sort of helps the other one and does even better, or a synergistic effect, and so on. And it is rather complicated. I'm not sure I understand it myself either, but we're getting there. It's something called MOST, excuse me, I also don't have COVID, a MOST, multi-phase optimization strategy, and essentially you're opening that box, if you like. You can actually see what's happening inside your intervention. And it does this in a way I will try to explain, but please, if you have any questions, let us know. So POI, remember, was a 4-armed randomised controlled trial. You had a group that got nothing, a group that got everything, and 2 groups that got 1 of those components. And that required us to have a sample size of 800. So it can either be called a 4-armed trial, or you can call it a 2x2. So half of them got the sleep stuff, other way around, sorry, half didn't get the sleep and half did, and half got the fab stuff and half didn't. What we're doing with our Moemoeā is actually having a 2x3 or an 8 group intervention. So that would automatically think that you're going to have a much larger trial, and recruiting whānau and so on to participate in these studies is a lot of work. That's not actually the case, because you analyse these data quite differently, so you get much more information for a much smaller sample and therefore much less money. So it's also a much more cost-effective way of looking at your answers. So I'll try and take you through this, but what it means is that we never compare, for instance, the effect of Group 1 not getting anything with Group 8, those who get everything. So you never compare any of the individual group allocations. What we do is at the end we'll say, well, how successful was what rongo? And so what you would do was analyse all those who didn't get rongo with all those who did. So you use every single participant in the trial just to look at rongo. And then you do the same for uru, and then again the same for whānau. The beauty of this is that we actually only need a really small sample to do this because of the way you analyse the data. If we did a very traditional RCT, what we'd have to have probably is 3 individual RCTs. You'd have one that would test rongo against control, uru against control, and whānau against control. That would mean that we would need 1,800 participants. That's actually quite a tall order for the way our terrible funding system works, because it's all over a short time frame and everything. You also can't estimate the interactions. If you had 3 individual trials, you've got no idea if rongo is even more successful with the whānau support. You've got no way of looking at that. So an alternative is you could have, go back one, did it again. Thanks. You could also do a 4-arm trial. So here you would have control or get nothing, and each of your 3 components. So we've lowered our numbers quite nicely, but we still can't estimate those interactions. We've still got no idea how it's all working together. Because of this way of analysing the data, with our most intervention, we only need 600 participants, and we can look at all the combinations and variations across those 3 individual components, and whether some work negatively with each other, positively with each other, or independently, and so on. So once we get to that wonderful place of developing all this wonderful work that the team is doing, then we're hoping to recruit 600 whānau across New Zealand. We've got a host of amazing partners that we're working with, including Plunket and a variety of Māori health providers. COVID has made this an online intervention. We initially wanted a face-to-face intervention that worked through the providers, and with the continued lockdowns and so on last year, we had to move to be a totally online intervention. That was an initial a bit of a concern to us, but actually your own HBA report talked quite a lot from the interviews that you guys had done about how much they did want some stuff online, and so hopefully this will be a positive rather than a negative. So there is considerable interest, of course, in developing new interventions around sleep. One of our PhD students did a very exhaustive search of the literature and found 2 things. Nobody's ever tried to identify the individual components and what might work in a sleep intervention, and there's almost no Indigenous sleep research in this capacity. So there's such a big hole for this sort of work, as well as just having so many potential health and well-beings. I am interested, came from an obesity angle, but I'm so much interested in all the wider areas as well. But of course the intervention's got to work for the community who actually it's designed for. It's got to be realistic, it's got to be feasible, it's got to be acceptable. But we do think by having this Māori-led design and this most approach that we really will be able to find out, develop something that really has got a good chance of working, and that can actually make a difference, an important health difference. We'd like to acknowledge our wonderful team, and we essentially couldn't fit all the names on the slide because it is a really big team, but we have got Pacific and Māori advisory committees, we've got some wonderful Māori and Pacific partners, child providers, and we're all travelling sort of in our individual wakas, but all heading to the same place, to our Moemoeā waka. So from Justine and I and the broader Moemoeā team, thanks very much. Ngā mihi. Come back up, Justine.
That was fascinating. So please put your hands up if you have questions. We have shy people today. Kia ora, Ngari.
Just around, kia ora, I really enjoyed that, thank you. Just around the evaluation of rongo time and the atua and using that model, I loved the model. I'm just wondering, you said you don't know how you're going to measure this, which is a developing thing for all of us, but I'm just wondering if we apply Western analysis on it, whether it's actually going to be measured. You know, like, have we really thought about that, applying, like, I look at your 3 po and think one goes with whānaus in there, so you can't separate one from the other. So, like, looking at it in a box form and sort of unpacking it and trying to see what, I'm just wondering if you're setting yourselves up really to go, no, because I wouldn't look at anything separately. It all comes together. Our atua can't be separated, and the way that we each interact with our atua is different. So yeah, just wondering if you've really thought about how you can do that.
Lots. You want to have a go?
Yeah. So we started having these questions for Christmas. One of the issues we had, firstly, trying to develop the components where everything was so interconnected, it was impossible to tease it out. And so that was issue number 1. I think this was the best way that we could frame it to, so we know it's connected. And plan B is to kind of pull it back together and take those back to our communities. Yeah, in terms of the measure, because it has to have credibility and all of those academic things, because we are an academic institution, and obviously, you know, potential issue, me bringing this mātauranga in obviously creates some of these issues, but yeah, we've looked at lots of things. So rongo is blank at this point. I'm having the conversations with people to kind of see how they actually might want it measured in the best way that we can. In terms of the study, we'll just do what we have to do, and then our next trick, I guess, will be to pull it back together and then present it that way. Yeah, probably not answering your question because we just don't know. We know it's a problem, and we definitely know that the current measures just won't do it, because no matter which way we even try to apply them, we're going to look bad, and our stats are going to, it's not going to work. So, yeah.
Sorry, I'll just follow on from that. Conversations we've been having for a long time and trying to sort of work around them, really. And one of the potential ways around it is the slides at the end there, I sort of had a yes-no. You either get it or you don't, but you can also have a sort of what we call a light or heavy option. So everybody might get some rongo time intervention, but there'd be a sort of light version and a heavy version. And the same with all 3. So it would mean that they're effectively all there in that sort of combination, but at different intensity levels, and that might be one of the options too. That it doesn't totally get round it, but helps with that puzzle. What, as Justine said, unfortunately we have bosses that want the outcomes as part of the challenge. So yeah, we're trying to do the best we can to, I guess, meet in the middle, preferably closer to one end, but yeah, as much as we can do.
I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed a lot of parts to it, and I'd just like to support what you're saying, Whaia. How do we find words for assessment in Māori? So you have a Māori whakaaro to that assessing it, because when we do something for Māori, then we use English language, we lose it. How can we maintain that by using the Māori word that keeps its authenticity? I think, yeah. Kia ora.
Yeah, I think, as I said, I've been using kia tau a lot today, because I was trying to, explain rongo to our collective is, and it's not peace and harmony, but it kind of is. And so actually kia tau is what we know we want. And, kia tau te Māori, kia tau te wairua, kia tau te takata. So how am we, so we do need to find a way to measure it so it works for Māori, because that's, that's who we're trying to lift first and foremost. So, welcome to my next few months.
Karen from Plunkett. I just want to, we've been working very closely with you, obviously, and when we say, Justine, around our consultation with community and kia tau Māori, the one thing that we're all struggling with is what does that actually mean across the continuum, because there's not going to be one answer. So working with co-creating what that particular mama's expectations might be, and then measuring if there's been a change is where the gold is, isn't it? It's just if it's changed for her, and that might be binging with Netflix rather than partying or hanging out with her mum. So the starting point for the families is what's important, and then a measure from there, which is not easy with an RCT. So good luck with that. And when you've cracked it, we can use it for all of the other things we're trying to measure. So Kāpai run that too.
I done that.
Justine, I think this is directly at you. From a Māori perspective, how did you cope with determining that whānau got different interventions rather than, one, their choice of what intervention they got, and two, the opportunity to have the whole lot? Because I've been involved in a project where we supplied kai, and we tried to split and give half the group cheap fruit, vegetables and legumes and half the group for free, and our kaumātua said, kaore, you cannot do it. And it completely threw our study. We had to give the whole lot free kai. And I'm just wondering for you, how did you manage that? Or are you so academic that it's kai?
Yeah. I haven't, and I think you'll hear probably the same kōrero in our Pacific Cruise thing. So I haven't. I struggle with the no, and I have lots of experts who do interventions who say even if they don't get something at the start, because everybody's going to be, so I don't even want to call it an intervention. We're not fixing Māori in our ways of doing. I think it's a koha. And so we're not the problem. This is not an intervention. But so those, especially those who get the no, will get it all at the end. I guess it's the consolation prize. Everyone assures me that just by being part of the study and the fact that you bring up sleep it gives them a little bit of something. So yeah, I mean, it becomes an issue, and maybe this study will bring, because we'll get to publish. So I'm sort of aiming to have this done by August. That's kind of wānanga time, right? Post Matariki. So sit down and do this publishing, and that will literally be a paper on actually academic processes in themselves, bring the supposed credibility, but they're actually just as harmful. So yeah, we'll probably maybe put that kōrero out and see if we can. But no, it's kind of yuck. But I have I'm building a house, which is why I'm living with my mum, and I have a daughter, and she's going house with me on it, and I have a mokopuna, and yeah.
Dario. Dario.
Kia ora korua, thank you for the kōrero. I just have a couple of parts. One of them was specifically around the resources that you're going to have to support the kaupapa, around the papa's role in that, and whether or not it's appropriate for them to be reciting ori in some senses, or just knowing, because I think a lot of whānau just think that the wahine's role to do ori in that space, but potentially if tāne know they can, then they can actually implement themselves into the process as well. I only say that because it lives in our whare. So when our latest boy, our tama, was born, our second eldest girl, she recited the ori when he was born. And so as he came into the soul, he heard his sister's voice, and so her voice is the voice that helps e roto i te ao moe. So that was just the first question. The other one was around the karakia and that you're going to supply. If people want the deeper versions, can they have them?
You can have it COD, yep. And is that the Hawaii baby? Exciting.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Congrats. Guess what he did in Hawaii when we were there? Yes, so I haven't, we certainly never got challenged on who can and can't pass on that gift to that pēpē. The main thing we wanted, and if people have their own, then obviously it's encouraging them to do it. We even had the notion of maybe give them a framework, even if they write it in English, that they can write their own, because it is part of that koha, right? It's how you build the āhua of your pēpē, as well as the deep and meaningful ones, and then the ones that are specifically related, obviously, to the kaupapa that we're doing. I think rongo time would be, so in your whare, with your wife trying to do a PhD and do those things, and then you get home from your busy day, I feel like it would be your job to almost lead the rongo time, to give her that space and to do those other things, and so those resources would be there. I'll talk to our kaitito, and he would have kept the deep ones, and because I think there are whānau that have it and know it, and what I hope you get from this, other than resource really, is just knowledge that what you're doing is cool, and ka pai, and validate how you parent, and then those that need the bit at the other end of the spectrum get that. So yeah, I'll flick you an email.
Okay, we might wrap that all up. I just really want to acknowledge you both. And you lasted with all those pātai, so well done. And I loved that you took the current state, the what of the sleep of whānau, and then you acknowledged the whānau realities, that context of whānau realities, as well as the role that tikanga can play and the role of atua in that as well. So just really important mahi, and it's really driving the kaupapa forward. And I actually, and all of the whakaaro and the pātai that came from the floor is helping to layer and add, and is like a koha to build that further. So thank you all. We've got the village of expertise in the room, and I think maybe Dario is offering his services perhaps in terms of adding that tāne element to and his current reality of raising his whānau with ori as well. So thank you all.